Continue. Start. And now we're good. Hello, 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 everybody.
Hello, everyone.
Just waiting for everybody to arrive. We want to give everybody a chance to get into the webinar. Just a couple things that we'll go over. The chat has been turned off. You do, however, have the ability to put any questions that you might have in the Q&A, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. We will answer them either during the webinar, or we will, if we don't get to them during the webinar, we will get to them at the end for sure. There were 20 people who registered, so I'm going to wait just another minute or so before we begin. While I'm doing that, let me share my screen. And you should now be able to see my screen and dragon. And let's see, we're up to 16, so I think that's pretty good. All right, I'm going to turn my camera off so you don't have to watch me talk with my hands, because that's a famous trait. All right, so welcome. Happy Monday, everyone. And we are going to be talking to you today about universal design for learning. And we're calling this an adventure in accessibility. Hence the dragon theme. So our agenda for today, and please remember this is a 3-part series. So we're going to give you a very easy assignment at the end of this webinar that you can use for the second webinar. And then the second webinar, we will continue with that same project throughout the 3 webinars. So that's coming later. But for now, we have an introduction, and then we're going to talk about the background. We're going to also talk about the components of UDL and why are we doing this, the reasoning behind it. So what is universal design for learning? First of all, universal design is devoted to helping students solve problems and make the resources easier and accessible for all learners, no matter what they may need it for. The other thing is, a lot of people seem to think that UDL is based on the need for accessibility. That is a half-true statement, by which I mean, yes, we need to do this for accessibility. However, it doesn't just benefit the students who need that for their accommodation or to help with their learning. It's the easiest example I can use would be thinking about sidewalk ramps or ramps to a building. Many of us use them and never give a second thought that those were intentionally created for people who needed an easier access to building or on the street or wherever. So although we may not need that, we may be using it and it may be helpful to us. So implementing universal design helps all learners, not just those who have either an accommodation that they need or they just need something a little different. So what is it? Universal design encompasses quite a few, it's actually a very large thing. So for example, it encompasses text, video, audio, documents, web page design, writing styles, and general layout and color. I mean, we don't necessarily think about all of those things when we're thinking about our course. So some little figures. Everybody likes figures, so let's talk about these. So there are over 2 million students that have a disability on college campuses throughout the United States. So that tells you that that is not a small number, that is a very large number. But people, you know, that's kind of big picture. So let's bring it down just a little. In the VCCS, there are 6,293 students who are currently using resources for accessibility. The number of students who need this is greater. And why do we know that? Is we know that many people who need those accommodations either A, don't make it to our disability services, or B, they feel uncomfortable talking about it. However, they still need them even though they are not listed here. Okay, hold on 1 second. One, two. I'm hoping that this gets better. I've turned off some things. So at Germanna, however, we have a total of 591 students who are receiving services. But again, I want to reiterate, these are the students who have self-identified. We have many students who have not identified themselves as needing accommodations or things from the Office of Accessibility Resources, which has a new name, and it's OR and not Disability Services. So make sure that you know that that is the new name for the office. So I'm going to turn this over to Wesley, and he's going to talk to you about the background.
Yeah, so we want to talk a little bit about where universal design came from, because this is kind of one of those topics. It's one of those terms that gets thrown around and used in a lot of educational circles. And so we want to be really clear about where that actually came from, especially since we're going to say that we need to be using it in all of our online courses, or all of our courses, not just online. So it really comes from 2 main places. It was originally designed in the Center for Applied Special Technology, which was done at an institution which I didn't write down and I should have, but it was part of the Center for Applied Special Technology. They're the ones who developed the framework of UDL. And it was developed out of neuroscience, was the idea of how our brain actually works. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in just a few minutes. It also gained a lot of ground very quickly in the K-12 world. And so we saw, and if you look at the charting the history of UDL, the K-12 world really adapted to it a little bit faster than necessarily we've seen in higher education. And so, you know, universal design requires change. It requires us to think through how our courses need to be different and what are the things that need to shift. And so sometimes those are things that happen a little bit faster on the K-12 scale than they do on the higher ed scale. So that could be why we see it have grown there faster. And a lot of the principles and things that we've talked about come out of that. The official definition of UDL that came from the Center for Applied Special Technology says that UDL engages the why, the what, and the how of learning. That's the framework here. And so it's less about how do I make my class, quote unquote, more accessible, but the universal design for learning is how am I actually engaging the learner where they are with what they need. So the how is where we give learners multiple ways to demonstrate action and expression. So that's the how of the learning. The why is that we give learners multiple ways to keep the learners engaged. And the what is we give the learners multiple ways to represent content in a course. We've given multiple representations of content. So if we're thinking this through, what does this mean for me as an instructor? What that means is that you as an instructor need to think through how you are presenting information, how students are engaging with you, and then how those learners are able to demonstrate their learning. And one of the really base principles of universal design for learning is to think of it in terms of +1. So, for example, if I were an instructor giving lectures in my class, that's great, but not all of my students necessarily can benefit from a lecture. So, what's one more way that I could give content to my students? Well, I could give them transcripts of that lecture, or I can make sure that there's captioning, or I could give them an article to read that reinforces what I talked about. So, I've provided another way for them to engage in content. And let's say that I want only my students to contact me with email, and so I want to keep them engaged there. Well, what's one other way I could do that? I could use a text number. I could use discussion boards. I could add one more way for students to communicate with me. Same thing with how learners can demonstrate their learning. Rather than just having just a quiz, what's one more way that I could do that? What's one more thing that they could do? What's one thing they could develop or create that allows them to demonstrate their learning? So for every interaction that learners have, that's with materials, with each other, with the instructors, with the wide world, there needs to be maybe just one more way for that interaction to happen. And that provides a good base for what we think about when we talk about this universal design. So the why of learning really is that effective network. That's how the learners get engaged and motivated. That's really kind of dealing with the emotional side of things. And so what we want to do is make sure that our lessons, that our courses stimulate interest and motivation for learning. I'm not going to talk about that today, but that's one of the things that's really, really important is this effective side of things. Then we talk about the what. That's the recognition. That's the cognitive side of things, where students are really making those cognitive leaps. They're being able to understand information, and we get it through all of the little processes that are needed for them to understand what's happening. And then they have the strategic network, or the how of learning, which is how they take that motivation and how they take that cognitive learning and they turn it into something that they have done, where they can express what they know in a different way. So the goal of UDL then is to create learners who control their learning. That's the idea. We want to create courses where students can control their own learning. And there was a quote in some of the materials we've looked at that really, I think, highlights this. Students are assessed by instructors, but learners assess themselves. And so the things that we're trying to do and that universal design really promotes is that we want our students to be thought of not as students, but as learners. How are they helping themselves along the course? And have I provided all of the materials necessary so that they can do that? Okay, I'm gonna pass it back to Paige, and she's gonna share with you some of these components of universal design.
Great, thank you. So how does UDL look in our courses? So what are the components? So I want you to take a look at this image, and what do you see? Thinking about this in terms just of color. So I'm going to take just a minute and I'm going to pull up something else, and I'm going to share that with you. If you just give me 1 second. New share. And I'm going to go over this little quick colorblind test. And the reason that I want to do this over Zoom is because this is even different on the display that you're using, and it's going to be different on the display I'm using and the way you're viewing the colors that you're going to see. So the test is basically looking at numbers inside of different colors and clicking on the correct number. Now, looking at these, you're going to come out with a result at the end that's going to tell you, it gets into your email, whether or not you perceived all of the colors accurately or not, and if you're seeing everything. However, if you're noticing as I'm progressing through the clicking, some of these are a little bit tricky. And so if you're not sure, you do have that ability to write not sure. And otherwise, you're just clicking through, and it's pretty short. It doesn't take very long, as you can see. It takes me longer to move my mouse actually than it does to see the numbers. And ooh. Oh, I did give you a time limit. So it is timed so that you don't sit there and stare too long at it, in case you're wondering. So again, and that's it. That was the last one. So then you're going to get a little pop-up that asks you to put in your colorblind results, and you put your little email address, or you can just click on the thanks. And what are we going to see here? it says I have normal color vision. So, but it also gives you a little information here about that you might know up to 25 people who are colorblind, and it talks, this is actually, you know, those really cool glasses. So, but I did want to share that with you because I really think that it is important to take that time that we need to think about things as simple as color, and think about color and text and color on things, whether it's a different color background or whatever. So CAST created this universal design for learning guidelines. And you notice these are the why, the what, and the how that Wesley just covered. So within these, they are talking about access, talking about building, and talking about internalizing. So, and then the goal, if you notice at the bottom, is to have expert learners who are purposeful and motivated, resourceful and knowledgeable, and strategic and goal oriented. So looking at these, and I'm not going to read you the chart, but looking at these, you can see it explains the, for example, clarifying vocabulary and symbols, clarifying syntax and structure. So those are, you know, different ways that you can change the representation of that what piece of this puzzle. Then the other thing is you're looking, these are just some of the things. So I know that most people, their first thought about UDL is, you know, taking things and breaking them down as far as accessibility components and text headers and things like that. But that's only a very small piece of the puzzle. So let's take a look just at multiple means of engagement. So here we have student choice. So looking at Canvas and allowing that personalization allows students to have a choice so that they could demonstrate their knowledge or goals, and their assessment could be, instead of a multiple choice quiz, they could have an essay or they could do a presentation, something like that, that allows the students to have some choice. Relevance. So it should be relevant to the course and the objective. So asking students to complete something and giving them options that is not tied to a course objective or module objective is really kind of pointless. The next thing is value. Content should have value to the student learning. So it cannot just be added videos because you think it's cool. That content needs to be directly tied to the course objective and activity and assessment. So thinking about maybe looking at your course for the first, I'll call it the spring cleaning or fall cleaning, as we happen to be in, that you may have some of those extraneous videos that don't really add any content or value to what the student is learning. And you might want to remove them. Or if you have multiple ones, you might pick a single video instead of having multiple ones. So the next one is removing distractions, kind of the same line of thinking. So it could be that you're removing distractions from a page. You could be removing distractions from the course. You could be removing distractions, whether it's sound. So those distractions can be many different things and can look very different in a course. Community. The learning environment should develop community and collaboration between the students. So this is something that we can do by having our students participate in breakout rooms, and we can have discussion boards, and we can have group projects, and we can have peer reviews and things like that. Those are all things that now you can see. Hold on one second. There we go. And reflection. Learning should culminate in a time of self-assessment and reflection. So at the end of every module, you want to think about giving the students a little time to figure out what it is they did well. And you may just ask the question as an open-ended question. You could have them do a journal entry. You have all kinds of options. And you can also use that to provide you with feedback. What were the things in this module that were the most helpful to you and why? And what activity and or assessment or project did you find the most beneficial for meeting the objectives of this module? So you could ask those kinds of questions at the end so that they could provide you with further development of your course, and it would also get them thinking about what they did in that module. So multiple means of representation is the next one. And so this is talking about information, alternatives for displaying auditory and visual information. So we're talking here alt text and captions. And thinking about alt text, it cannot just be the name of the file. You want to be very descriptive when you're giving alt text information. Vocabulary, clarifying language and symbols, syntax, and structure for non-familiar students. So thinking about our students who are not native English speakers, we want to make sure that we are not putting extra words that make the actual meaning of whatever it is we're trying to say more difficult to understand. So we're cleaning up, and back to the fall cleaning, we're cleaning up some of our, I'll call it, lack of a better term, flowery vocabulary in order to make our content very clear. Illustrate, provide examples of language, mathematical notation, symbols through multiple media. So here we're talking about giving visual and text representations that help students clearly understand the concept that we're trying to let them know about, as well as giving them multiple ways to look at either if it's math or if it's music, that, those are the kind of things that you're providing that extra thing so that students have multiple ways, that +1, to get that content. Background knowledge, activate or supply previous knowledge in learning events to promote comprehension. One of the best things that when we're talking about background knowledge is that you can do a kind of course at the beginning of your course. What do you know and what do you understand, and kind of do a survey of where the students are coming from, what kind of things they like, where, what's their background, and taking that information and understanding that it is providing you with a basis to move forward. So for example, thinking about asking students to solve a math problem that relies on them having knowledge that isn't typical. So for example, the math problem could be on a par 3 golf course, on a par 3 hole, what is the yardage between the pin and the tee? Well, there's a whole lot that you need to know in order to even be thinking about that. You have to take in mind, you have to keep that in mind, that most students don't know anything about a golf course, or if they do, it's a very small number. So when we're writing problems out, we need to be thinking about what background knowledge am I asking for students to have in order to solve this or work it out before I move on. Guide learning, highlight patterns, critical features, big ideas, relationships, and processing of content. So, this is the connect the dots piece. So asking, or at the end of the modules, when you're doing that wrap up, talking about how things tied up for that week, and then how they're leading into the next week. And what are those concepts that they will be building on in the next week, rather than simply just letting that week go and not providing some of those necessary connections. Transfer, help learners connect information to future problems and tasks, which goes with what I just said, which was guided learning. And if I can find the mouse, there we go. Multiple means of action and expression. So physical action, varied methods for response and navigation. So that, of course, is slightly more difficult in an online course, but it would be possible if they were doing projects or looking for, I'm thinking like going outside and doing surveys of outside and collection and that kind of thing. Tools, provide access to tools and assistive technologies. Here's where JAWS and Dragon and all of those things come in that our OA Office of Accessibility Resources can provide for students. Communication, use multiple media to communicate and allow communication through multiple media. So that's the Wesley already talked about it. That is the email, that is the videos, that is using some kind of texting, and all of those things allow students to communicate in the way that's best for them. Support. Provide graduated levels of support for practice and performance. These are things like self-check quizzes and the reflection and having peer reviews before a final paper. All of those are graduated levels. So you can think about this as scaffolding, and when you're building your lessons, thinking about how you can use students to support students and how you can support students with the way that you design and build your content. Planning and strategy goes right along with support. It is support development of goal setting, management, and planning. So you have to think about planning the course well in advance. And during last March, when we all went online, we were day to day at best. Some of us might have been week to week, but almost none of us were truly, let's get the course built from start to end and then launch it to students. So, it was kind of a trial by fire, but now we have some time and some background that we can all fall back on what worked and what didn't work and how we set up our courses. Monitor. Provide support to monitor learner progress and provide learners for monitoring themselves. So in Canvas, we have new analytics, and the students have access to that as well. And so do you, and you can use those new analytics to see where students are and to provide that extra support or motivation that's needed in order for them to be successful. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Wesley.
Thanks, Paige. So we wanted to kind of end our first session. I say end like we're going to end in 5 minutes or so. It'll be a couple more. But we wanted to kind of end our discussion today talking about why this matters, because that's great. We've walked through the framework. We've talked about its background. We've talked about what UDL is. But why does this actually matter for us? Well, there are two really big components of this, and it has to do with some requirements. The first are just regulatory requirements. We're required by law through the Federal Department of Education that since we give federal money to students, that our courses have to be accessible to those students. It's also going to have to do with government grants and other things. So it's required that we make sure that our courses are accessible. Now, we kind of have two models to think this through. That could be the model of, well, I'll just fix it when that happens. So if I get a student that has a particular need or a particular service that is needed for them to take my class, I'll deal with it then. May not be the best model for us to follow, just because, like we talked about at the very beginning, universal design for learning is meant to help all learners, not just learners who need extra services. Like we talked about with physical accessibility things, who it all uses, ramps when we go up into buildings rather than the stairs. It's more than just people who are in wheelchairs or people who have particular disabilities. Mothers with strollers use them. People just use them for a more gentle walk. So there are lots of reasons why these things exist, even though they were created for people with specific needs. The same is true for our courses. So there's some regulatory requirements there. Now, one thing I do want to point out here is that for the past few years, this has been kind of a hot button topic among educational law. And that's because this is a thing that people who have certain accessibility issues are going into online courses and seeing, well, are these things accessible for me? And if they're not, then they have grounds to sue the school. And so there's some law cases out there that have been happening where some institutions have had to pay quite a bit of money in legal fees because their courses weren't accessible. So we want to just keep that in mind, that we want to make sure that we're making sure that our courses are accessible for all students. And we think about that beforehand. The other part is just the idea of business, because we are a college, we are kind of have that business side of things. And so what does UDL offer us? Well, it improves our learning programs. It improves the results. If students have what they need, they're going to have a better experience, they're going to be more satisfied, and they're going to have what they need to be successful. And that's ultimately our goal, is that our students are successful. It benefits diverse learners, and you're going to hear us say that quite a bit, that idea of diverse learners. courses, because that's the idea. It doesn't matter where you are on the spectrum of ability, you're a diverse learner, and we want to make sure that our courses are accessible for you. And then it provides those equal learning opportunities for all participants. Doesn't matter one way or another. So why does UDL work? Why is this something that works? Here are just a few things pulled from what we've talked about today and looking forward that make universal design for learning something that works in our courses. Some things that it can do. It minimizes those reading challenges caused by color blindness, weaker vision, or total vision loss. We talk about that, and Paige showed us the Enchroma key piece where you can see your color blindness test, and we talked about the idea of images, but it's not just images. It could be text, it could be the formatting of texts. There could be lots of things that cause challenges for students with reading, and so using an approach for universal design helps minimize those challenges. It makes navigation easier for those with mobility challenges. That's what we talked about, like with ramps instead of stairs at schools, but we're also talking about just navigating our courses. That's why a consistent navigation in online courses is essential to universal design for learning, because any student from anywhere knows how to get to the next available spot. And so that's part of this, is making sure that the way that we've even designed their interaction in the learning management system in Canvas is something that promotes universal design. It removes barriers that may be caused by accents or dialect. It's something that just happens. We all come from different places. We all have different types of accents, and sometimes those can be hard for other people. And so if we complete that plus one thinking, that includes ourselves. How do we give students one more way to interact with this content that may or may not be including us? And so there's some ideas, some thoughts there. It revolves some level of issues from dyslexia. It can't remove everything, but it can take care of some of those really basic parts just by talking about how we structure text on a page, talking about how we make sure that the fonts that we use, the size of fonts we use, those are all things that go into helping someone with dyslexia, and enables those with hearing loss to learn course content, because we don't want anyone who has had any type of ability or a loss of hearing to be able to be in a place where they can't learn. That's why they're taking our courses, and that's what we want them to do. So hopefully that gives us just a really good groundwork to start from when we talk about universal design. So you may be wondering, now, Wes, Paige, you've shared these things with us. That's great. But, what are we supposed to do with this? Well, one, we've structured this as kind of a 3-part series. And we did that intentionally because we know that we all have a lot going on this semester. But we want to make sure that moving forward, that we can walk through this together. And so today was more groundwork. And then our next time that we meet in October, we're going to dig a little deeper. And then in November, we're really going to lay it all out. And so we have a little bit of homework for you guys that we would like for you to do, is we'd like for you to identify a module or unit in your course. That's what you need to do. Identify something in your course and how we're going to think about how we can apply universal design for learning for that module or that learning unit. So the thing that we want to ask you to ask is to determine if you followed that +1 rule in that module or unit. Do students have multiple means of engagement? Do they have multiple means of interpretation? Do they have multiple means of expression? Is that something that's visible there? And if not, what's one shift you could make, or what's one shift you could add that creates a +1 opportunity for your students? I want you to go ahead and try to think about how you could implement that and do it. Now, if you're looking at this and saying, Wes, Paige, this is great. Thanks for sharing this. But I have a lot going on and I don't know if I'm going to have time for this. I don't have time for more homework with all the other things happening. Know that we hear you and we're all in the same boat. And that's why we're saying, what's one shift? What's one thing? Because I think a lot of times we take this idea of universal design for learning or accessibility and think we have to change everything overnight. And that's not what we're saying. We're asking what's one shift, what's one thing that you can do in one module to make that module more accessible for our students, more universal for what they're doing. Okay, so that's going to conclude what we have for you today. We want to thank you guys for coming out. We want to thank you for joining us today. And we will be happy to send out this idea of homework slide if you need us to send it to you. We're happy to send that to you so you can have it But this is something that we're going to be talking about over the next few months. And so if you have questions, if you have thoughts or concerns or things that we can talk about with you, if you want to process this a little bit more on a one-on-one setting, we want to encourage you to join us at some of our open office sessions that we have with IIT, or you can always reach out to Paige and I, and we can create a one-on-one appointment or have a group appointment, whatever that wants to look like for you. We're happy to walk you through this because it's kind of a big thing to wrap your mind around. How do I make these kinds of shifts in my classes? And what are the things that are needed for my students that are accessible? So again, just want to thank you guys out. I'll turn my video back on so you can actually see me. Want to thank you guys for coming out. We will make sure that you get a copy of the PowerPoint. I will say that this PowerPoint currently, we're kind of building all 3 sessions in it at once. And so we'll have to pull the slides out from session 1 and we'll provide that for you so that you can see those. And then we'll add to as we go. But we want to make sure that you guys have everything that you need. If you have any questions or anything, feel free to continue to use the Q&A. Other than that, thanks so much for coming out, and we will see you guys at our next session.
Yeah, I put the dates up because they weren't on there.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course, I used 2 different things, but yeah, that's part for the course for today.
It'll be okay. Thank you guys for coming.